Fuschel and IFSR.
I'm on now. Hello.
Oh, aha, you are there.
Yeah, Jason, good to see you. Good to see you. So I'm known to some of the people here, and I want to make it short because I'm just jumped in now and so on. So a few things to correct and to add. First of all, I'm not IFSR anymore. In 2018, I stepped back as a Secretary General. And what the IFI is now doing, you can or cannot watch anymore because it's almost disappeared from the world. I'm very sorry for that. But I can't help it. But what I did in the meantime is I collected all IFI newsletters, started with 1981 or so up to 2018, and now it is stored on the history file or so of the ISSS. I think very soon it will really go public. So all the newsletters are there. My next step is to collect, and most of them have collected all the official proceedings and have them scanned and also presented also via the ISSS. The third question which came up is now Charles François Encyclopédie. There is one thing which the BCSS did. They put the encyclopedia on a PDF version on their home site. So you can look up all the items, but it's not as Charles actually envisioned a hypertext thing. Charles actually did a paper hypertext version, to call it that. And now my intention is to really build a real one together with the GSIS, Wolfgang Hofkirchner's Association. And we hope to get out something in 2 months or so, which is then really useful for doing hypertext and searching. And actually, there's a background, a longer project will take more. It's the Gloss Up project where especially Latin America is working on it. So that's sort of my thing now. And I'm retired and I enjoy retirement, so I don't want to do much anymore, but listening and seeing. And one little thing to Heiner, although Kotzebue, one of the very firm, said, we authors, we want to be less praised and more read. So that's to some of you think, well, I didn't read that. Okay, so thank you and welcome to everybody. I will join in very soon again, hopefully. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gaha. Okay, questions, please. I have a small one. How the Institute of 21st Century Agora is currently funded? Is it membership-based or grant-based or client-based? How it is working right now?
I'm sorry, Jason, I couldn't quite hear you.
Oh, my question is for the Institute of 21st Century Agora, how does it actually funded at this time? So is that a grant-based or membership-based or client-based, I mean contract-based? How does it run for the moment?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I can tell you what we had tried to do. We had tried to approach foundations, and it was a difficult sell. We do have occasionally contracts, but because we don't want to compete with practitioners, the contracts really go to practitioners who are affiliated with the Institute. So we don't want to be a in-the-field practice group unless we're doing it as a training. That's to say, to get a community together to do something. Now, I'll illustrate how this played itself out in Crete, when Aleko Christakis and Maria Kakulaki established a community agora with the support of the local political body. And this they call the Demoscopio. So they were able to get a studio space within a multiple use building that was just constructed. And they gathered the community together to deal with some social problems. It's not the matter that the problems are hypercritical, but rather that the model of working together is hypercritical. So the community discovered how to work with the issues of stray dogs, which is a significant problem. And they produced very satisfactory results. There was a lot of political enthusiasm for the process and the Demoscopia. And then the political powers fought if for want of a better word, for ownership of that inquiry engine. And of course, you could imagine that if it went to one party, it would be turned on another, or in some ways embarrassing another. So it was a fragile model. And in fact, the Agoras, which promotes the practice of the studio process, the collaboratories of democracy, has come to realize, I believe, that it can't survive in a vacuum. It has to be in a larger context of other processes. And you've heard from Heiner about some of those, and you've heard from Peter about a lot of those. The real issue is that the steering committee that legitimizes the organization in a community is the most likely source of attracting revenue from community foundations to support the organization. However, it is being run without significant funding, and it has been for the last decade. It was launched because a USDA grant came into Aleco's venue, and it needed a nonprofit organization in order to accept those funds for that one project. But it was not intended as a sustainable model based upon the funding. The sustainability of the Institute is going to depend upon communities that decide to institutionalize new models for thinking. And the work that I'm doing right now in the South Coast of Massachusetts is working closely with a regional nonprofit organization. But first, to engage the community around the notion of working together. They've had a forum. In the past, it was very successful. And the forum allows people to decide what it is that they think they don't know enough about. If you can identify what it is that you don't know enough about, you can legitimize a design session. But if you can't get agreement that something is worthy of an investment of energy for design, you're not going to be able to start. That's an illustration of how the very focused efforts of the Institute for 21st Century Agoras are totally dependent upon a larger envelope of civic engagement. Peter might have comments on this as well, because he's been working with the civic arena with university students. He is primarily training, I would say, practitioners of the future. And I would say that Heiner is very much working with communities, and I've been working with practitioners in my area.
Yeah, Peter, let us know what's going on in Canada.
So the way I see the evolution of the Agoras Institute is that after having kind of run the Agoras, as through the board, as a knowledge creation institute that was conducting some of its own research, was also hosting, if you will, the community of practice, the communities of practice. So in a way, it was a center not for the practitioners, but that legitimized all the practitioners that used variations of the SDD engagement methodologies, and that were using the different software tools. Now we had multiple research projects and education projects that have evolved into, in my case, university level training for the participation in structured dialogic design. And I've done some training of facilitators and some development of practice with facilitators that does take one-on-one apprenticeship, which is probably one of the weaknesses of the kind of nonprofit model. We didn't have, we were looking either for a foundation support or more enduring support. Both in US and Canada, we were able to do, small scale training and support with our practitioner community, but we didn't have regular kind of public training sessions. More of that has been done actually through the Future World Center, which is really a partner, you could say is a partner organization with the Agoras, completely in line with that Heiner had talked about, his relationship with the Future World Center and Janos Luris's group. And so how things evolved with the Agoras in Toronto was was actually to develop, first of all, kind of a training and competency center through my courses, where I'm providing a limited, through coursework education, but also through Design with Dialogue, of the availability of public experience with flavors of dialogic design, the occasional lecture, but then through Design with Dialogue community of practice, the monthly 3-hour, face-to-face public engagement sessions. That those were, if you will, the embodiment of the Agora as a concept. So that's the equivalent to setting up the Agora as a public square space for continuing exploration of dialogue for design context in these areas of exploring rich issues like that. So so with a history of Design with Dialogue, one of the things I probably said this very quickly, but in the slide describing the history of DWD and the kind of evolution from a community of practice to a public issues forum, small scale, but very powerful kind of group of people that would take on these issues and develop artifacts at the conclusion of a 3-hour workshop. In retrospect, I can now see how this was really following the Agora concept of developing our own equivalent to the Demoscopio. And we didn't have a dedicated, room. Like Aleko's view of the Demoscopio was that it's preferable to have a situated place in a town that's always available, and the artifacts of the dialogues are made available almost like a museum, or they're browsable, they're accessible, they're physical. And we found it's probably more efficient to do this online, but you lose the tangibility, the locality, the impact of the democratic engagement. Online processes lose their democratic vocality, or you might say if it was John Searle, might speak to illocutionary force. There's a force to the local presence of the engagement and the ability to take action from these engagements. And we have from time to time. That is, we'll use a deliberation, there'll be sufficient energy and engagement, and that will grow into something else. And so instead of a Demoscopio, we've got now multiple communities of practice that have had their own kind of boards, their own ongoing communities at different points of time. So the Unify Toronto dialogues formed after a group after the Occupy Toronto movement kind of broke up after the camps were folded and people kind of went back to lick their wounds and figure out what to do next. There was a group of kind of leading activists or more organizers that had worked with multiple activists, like I have. I'm more of a meta organizer and a professor rather than a direct activist. And so we formed a group based on DWD and this dialogue, this approach to design dialogue. And that's been ongoing ever since then. We've done, and then we will spend up to 2 years on dedicated issue topics. So we had 2 years on local economies and 2 years, 2-year or more project called Indigenize or Die, which during the course of that, we had multiple talking circles with Indigenous elders and teachers and sacred leaders. And that led to some actions like the repudiation of Canada Day, which is now considered to be, to have an alternative Indigenous Day. And this has led to it leads to these opportunities. And that's one of I can't say it's a direct result of the deliberative planning, but having these ongoing public square type of Agora dialogues leads to ready-made capacity that is, in reserve and available for this. So the Unified Toronto has almost completely now folded into Drawdown Toronto. So, the project Drawdown, that was the kind of science and practice of local climate change action based on top scientific articles or the scientific modeling showing impact on carbon and drawing that down by 2050. And so we've developed that has led to an actual nonprofit and its own kind of now activist or climate action group. So it spins off another social system. We have other ones as well, a new economy social community of practice that was practitioners working with the developing research area of flourishing business models and strongly sustainable enterprises that are organizations that are developing, operating processes and business models founded in strong sustainability theory and ecological economics. And that sounds like a very obscure, but necessary kind of research area. Well, it's a big community of practice now. So this is, I think, actually very close to Ken Bausch's original idea. He had a colorful expression for wanting to populate the world with agoras of the 21st century, like crabgrass, like they would just sprout up and grow. And what I've learned is that the communities really have to fit their context. And in Toronto and in Canada, there's a certain way of engagement that works, and that has spun off multiple communities. Systems Thinking Ontario is another one, which everyone here ought to consider attending, because now it's mostly online. It's every second Monday. And we have, ISSS speakers, David Ng, and I've been co-leading that for 8-10 years now. So these are all spin-offs of the Canadian Agoran context.
How about Heiner? You're in Vienna or in Berlin? What's the
No,
situation?
I'm in Berlin.
You're in Berlin. So what's the situation around you?
Well, you see, I met Peter Jones various times. I met Tom only one time. It was in Cyprus, and I refused to be part of the 21st Century Agora because in advisory board or whatever management board, because I feel we need the diversity of methods. We need competition with approaches. And that's why I felt it is much better to really, what Ken Bausch said, make the Agora bus, make the spreading of good solutions, means and ends, and bring that together. And you see, I'm more like an activist and observer, and I felt it is very important to go back to the roots, like Charles Francois has collected in the encyclopedia, that Eric Jansch was the motor behind this. These meetings in Alpbach and Bellagio, where later, 2 years later, they claimed they founded the Club of Rome, to really look into what is the thing connecting us and how we involve the people. So you see, maybe I had a mentor, it was Herbert Stachowiak. He created the general model theory in the mid-50s. And then they were together with Eric Jansch in 68, looking into how systems and models can unite, how physical built models, immersive model, virtual models, but also mental models can help us to really tackle this big, deep problematic Christakis is talking about. So I think this Agora ideas with people who were really hands-on and as a polyhisto, very broad, were really helping us to tackle the issues we have nowadays. We not just have one language. I introduced our honorary president of the Agoras, John MacDonald, to Ken Bausch, to really bring multi-track diplomacy and peacemaking together, because our ideas of voting and ranking, it's dominated, and it's making us being fragmented. And I felt I can really help and make connections. And what I did recently was the history of indigeneity, because what we didn't discuss here, and I had to cut short my presentation, was how Christakis linked to the traditions. The American Indians, like LaDonna Harris, speaking for all North American tribes, and then linking with Elis also to the Maoris, to really have the values and the context included. And I'm just trying to help a little bit with this encyclopedia. I think we still have a lot of way to do to really go beyond the need to agree and be more tolerant. And these traditions, like having the 4 or 5 hours, to really look into the values and not just the wording, but what does it mean and where it is applied and where is it misused. But I didn't get the question.
Lower.
Yes, the real success in this field was the Club of Rome and the limits to growth. The success we need now is transforming the physical world and the physical resources of things to the relationships and symbolic structures through which we see an image and our narrations occur, because what we need is a limits to thinking. The ability to understand the limits to thinking is precipitated today because we are all off in our little cubbies around the world. But there is a common challenge for each of our cubbies, and that is artificial intelligence and machine learning. They have such constrained notions of truth tables, of a Boolean and Bayesian architecture that is able to create decisions, analytic capacity far superior to your or my thinking patterns. And so the issue for us is an equation. And the equation is artificial intelligence, machine language, and learning on one side equals natural and collective intelligence. Only the natural and collective intelligence can regulate and complement machine learning, robotics, and the amount of money put in by our defense departments. There are 30 national programs on roadmaps to artificial intelligence and machine learning for nations, 30 of them. And China and US are at the top of the list there. So the ability for us to have a success and get us out of our cubbies into a common endeavor is focusing on the limits to thinking and comparing that to the existential threat of artificial intelligence and the learning that is not natural, the learning that does not deal with, as Heiner said, about context, the ability, because cybernetics for me is a science of the organization of context through which we see. What Kenneth Boulding talked about in terms of the image in his book, icons, etc., no one's taken it much further. So our task in limits to thinking is organizing our tool sets such that it can complement and regulate the coevolution of artificial intelligence machine learning, which is our human artifact. We are creating an environment that has the, quote, sacred capacity of evolution, emergence, and capacities to link our intelligence to the zone of fitness, which we are desperately separated from today. We are becoming severely autistic, like our technologies and those who create our technologies. masterful, unbelievable mathematical wizards. But that is a symbolic system meant for objects. And if the world was only billiard balls, by God, we would have the best science in the universe. Unfortunately, we have things like chemistry, biology, sociology, interactions of living systems, and the larger system. Without us thinking about the limits to thinking and how do we complement our own creations, I think Bateson said it best, those who do not understand the whole, disaster is inevitable.
Bravo, bravo,
And
wonderful.
so what we're trying to do is say, you know, there's something beyond our consciousness. There's something beyond the tools that we reveal the world through, our telescopes, our microscopes, our AI, our machine learning. So what is that? No voice is able to really be articulate, as you gentlemen have been today. And so this voice needs to be heard. The foundations need to be alerted that they're not dealing with problems. They're dealing with the problemique. And that term came up in the 1700s. And I've just completed a study on the American founders and their Republic letters and Invisible College. That is what they focused on. The system, the problem of problems, the problemique, how it interrelates. Unfortunately, the French Enlightenment went the way of absolutism, reason, etc. The Scottish Enlightenment understood the systems, and that informed the American Revolution. So we had a live experiment that we're all part of in democracies. It's being threatened now because we have no voice to respond to authoritarianism and its efficiency and its cognitive simplicity. So just in summary, we need to go from limits of growth of physical objects to limits of thought. We have an opportunity to organize, quote, against, I hate saying that we need an enemy, but we have an enemy of AI and machine learning. If you follow anything that the Department of Defense in the US and elsewhere are doing, autonomous killing robots is the reality we have today. So how do you counter that and increase the efficiency of those machines, yet have the counterweight?
I think that
I apologize.
you hit a very good point.
I get on little soapboxes.
No, this is very important. I think
Very
it's
relevant.
important
Yeah.
because the issues of concern have to meet the issues of fact on a level playing field, and challenge in that. What our artificial systems can't do that our natural systems use emotional for where we ought to be going. Hassan Osbakan said that the real problem with technology is that can implies ought. So it drags us along its own trajectories. I think that the emotional dimensions of the dialogue are very critical, and it can be managed. As far as fixing the problem with AI, that's very difficult because we're in an environment where we are fighting a tremendous amount of momentum that already frames what we should be thinking about. And if we feel that it's inappropriate, we have to stand up and say, well, I know that's very well reasoned, but something's missing. And that's a very difficult thing to say in a public environment, that you simply haven't considered other important things. But I think what you're raising is this notion of trying to reduce thinking to a mechanical process pulls the human heart out of the equation. And it is the way in which we use our emotions productively in dialogue that really determines the quality of that dialogue, both in terms of how it's experienced and also how it can be transmitted. That's my view.
If I could just introduce one cybernetic law that I find fascinating. It's called Conway's Law. It comes out of the software development world that I used to be part of out in Silicon Valley. And Conway's Law says, in the very conversation and communication is embedded the design architecture of what you will design. Now, let me just say that is the social boundaries you think through and you communicate through are embedded in the very way you talk. So the ability to have conversations that disembed, that expose the inherent design principles is extremely important. By each of your gentlemen's conversation today is the assumption is in conversation we can free ourselves, but we have to realize that we are imprisoned in our own designs, and that lead us, as you said, Tom, in a certain trajectory of vector. And we're in a very bad vector of a positive feedback loop that has no counter.
We have Paul Congaro with us today. Paul, are you there? Would you like to say something? Hello?
Hello, Paul.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry, I am here.
Oh,
I
please.
apologize. I was in the other room, but I was listening with interest. Thank you for the opportunity. Let me just make a couple of comments. The only thing I know how to do is to propose alternatives. I can't fight individually or even as an organization the capitalist system that is benefiting large platform companies that are using AI to their advantage. But my current project in the New Macy initiative is to propose alternative algorithms, heuristics more properly called, to the ones we have today. And I'm doing exactly what one of the earlier speakers, I think it's what the other speaker intended, which was to compare what the digital culture and digital ideology creates by way of computation and assumption, billiard balls of the universe kinds of calculations. That was an eloquent idea. And offering alternative computations that are more humane, organic, biological, et cetera. That's a topic perhaps for another time. I don't think now is the time to go into that. But the best that I can do is say bad, alternative, and to take those alternatives and literally to produce prototypes, design patterns, perhaps workshops, other things. And this is one of the major forks of the New Macy effort right now. So.
Eric?
Yeah, Paul, I'm glad you could join us and hear some of this discussion as well. Lowell, I wanted to respond in terms of Conway's law. One of the things we want to be clear about, then the implication of that is that the form of AI in the applications that we're going to see will be directly representative of the motivations and the values and what are considered to be the value proposition opportunities of the founders and decision makers of the companies that are invested in that technology. There is this kind of mythology that it will be self-organizing, especially through machine learning, that it will lead to a certain type of intelligent beachhead, if you will, that is somehow available as this kind of standing reserve to enable different applications. But we know, from Alul, from Özbekan, from Ivan Illich, and from our own observations, that these are very value embedded contexts. We have in systems thinking Ontario, and we have one of the so next one's second Mondays at 6 o'clock. One of the system map presentations we're going to have from my students' work from this fall is a system map on bias in AI technology that reveals some of those dynamics. But of course, it's very, this is just a way of constructing the narrative so people can understand what the frame of discourse is in the first place. Tom didn't mention this, but it would be interesting. You might be interested in knowing that that our Agoras community, one of the projects that was part of sustaining, not so much the institute, but the practice community around it, was one of our projects not so long ago, within the last 5 years, was with the Air Force Research Institute on autonomous sensing systems, and basically working with their AI and autonomy lead scientist at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And one of the reasons that I was interested, so as a peace activist, I mean, I am a active peace activist. I'm the chapter head for Greater Toronto area for World Beyond War. I hosted the World Beyond War International Conference at OCAD in 2018. But I'm also of the opinion that we have to, not avoid engagement, but take the opportunities if we have them. And so Tom and Kevin Dye and I, working with Aleco, facilitated and brokered a series of dialogic design workshops with AFRL senior scientists and engineers that were designing a 20-year roadmap for the future of the future of autonomous sensing systems, and to determine what drivers would have the most impact on decisions for different types of scenarios and outcomes. And so these are some of the scientists who are directly wrestling with the ideas of whether there should be always a human in the loop for an autonomous system to make, to pull the kill switch, or whether actually they could design even a better, there were engineers who believe they could design a more ethical and more precise and accountable technology that would make the decision on itself. So these decisions were inherent, like in these dialogues. But if they didn't have at least this type of structure for the discussion, my concern was, we hosted this without a trace of, any type of our own politics involved at all. But the part that I was very interested in seeing was whether we could expand the circle of stakeholders to the point where we could include, I guess we could call them ethical, not just ethical scientists, because these were ethical scientists and engineers, but ethicists and people that are working with, dissenting scientists and engineers that are part of this overall discourse, but that are on the side of describing, warning, describing other outcomes and scenarios that might not have been considered. And so in terms of this kind of seeking a broader or a greater scope of second and third order cybernetic variety, we were looking to expand the circle of discourse so that we could continue to influence this discussion. There is a way in which these, I wouldn't say organizations, but the AI organizations themselves self-organize to prevent themselves from hearing the dissent. And so I'll just say, as we got too close to actually the success of in a sequence of these dialogues, our luck ran out when we started to reach beyond, the organization itself. So that's probably all I can say, especially in a recorded thing. But it is public knowledge that we held these sessions, and there's a public document on it that's, we've published about this process, and in the Journal of Technological Forecasting and Social Change, and also in the Defense Technology DTIC platform. So we have published about the organizational dynamics of this as well. We think that it's an interesting organizational problem that as you continue to expand variety, there may be a point where it becomes self-limiting, where the stakeholders that might actually dissent might be stakeholders that are not part of the decision process. And so there's a self-limiting process. I'm not saying that's unethical. I think these were as ethically as we could quote. It wasn't a deliberate intervention, but it was a choice on my part to continue to work with these sessions, because I really believe we, the cybernetics and systems community, need to work directly with these problems with the stakeholders themselves. So
Wonderful.
Peter,
One of you.
Could I just,
one of you mentioned that during the email conversation that you had a brief contact with ODM people, Organizational Development Network. And also, I wonder if you have any involvement with International Facilitator Association, International Association for Facilitators, IAF. Both ODM and IAF are very big organizations full of practitioners working on the group process. So I wonder if 21st Agora, 21st century Agora have any relationship with this existing community.
With the relationship with practitioners?
Yeah, for example, in association facilitators, international association of facilitators and the organizational development network, they are pretty large, and each conference will probably have 1,000 attendees. So I wonder what is your little circle have any kind of interaction with those kind
Yeah, I'm Jason. I'm having a hard time understanding exactly what the question is. The Institute of 21st Century Agoras does have challenges in interfacing with other organizations, much as Heiner had said, because it appears to be a monolithic process. They could be a part of other things, but cannot be other things. And I think that's an important part of issues with different people who practice in different ways.
One example would be that change handbook that they.
Oh, yeah.
Is that Peter?
Yeah, we've been around NCDD for a long time. I mean, I'm probably one of the original members and was probably an early bridge to the Institute for that, and Tom and others have been involved. We've attended the conferences at different times. I think in terms of the NCDD practice, kind of practice community, I think there's a lot of we don't position ourselves in the formal facilitation mode because we don't train or view. We see it as a systemic process and not as a facilitative process that would be similar to what you might learn in an IAF. Although we respect IAF and have have an understanding of their process, it's a meaningful approach to public engagement, of course, that they advocate. The NCDD community has been more of our home turf, I think, because there's a broad variety of kind of creative dialogue process, and there are a number of systems thinkers that, like Tom Attlee, whose principles, especially Tom's work in wise democracy and his kind of continuing development of research and practice are similar, of a very similar values base to ours, I think. And we've shared some with Tom, and I follow his work very closely, as well as some others. But I think that there's if you wanted to look at a kind of where our where we would be if we were taking a more principles only, and not as we follow a lot of system structure, and Tom probably has more of a kind of a complexity mixed methods orientation, and develops kind of tools for dialogue, like the like the facilitation card deck and things like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of compatibility across the different dialogue processes. As Heiner had indicated, there's a very large and complex landscape of different approaches. And within the NCDD, we are not very well understood. Former presidents had told us they just don't understand what we're talking about. We're talking about design dialogue specifically. And there are dialogues that are generative, and they're designed to let you talk about problems. But to re-envision a problem is a difficult thing, because often when we talk about problems, we're competing for who has the best handle on the story. And we're trying to shift that dialogue entirely away from the issue of if you present an idea, that's it. Let's not argue over that. Let's explore the relationship between ideas that we have not considered before. Now, this type of a heavy-duty design is not appropriate when you don't have enough complexity to really worry about things. But in a highly complex system, it has tremendous capacity to allow people to identify a new understanding. I'd like to add that I earlier had said that the result of the structured dialogic design is an ISM that primarily serves to create community buzz or talking about something so that the community will think about something. I don't want to sell short the fact that when we get into solution space, which is often the space of greatest contention, the same process can be used to generate options and construct scenarios. And because it uses a language that's created during the process, the convergence of those scenarios are possible with far greater ease. Their modular similarities can hang together, and the unique features represent trade-offs, which are never easy, but get you to the point of a preferred action plan. I didn't want to take us down that route, but that's where the technology can go. And even that preferred action plan then is a suggestion, which goes to a project manager who has the task of loading the resources and setting timeline. So what we provide is a forum for thinking about things in new ways in highly complex situations. And that doesn't quite fit with the NCDD's notion of engaging the community in many ways, but to be generative, to create a sense of community, to create an understanding of otherness, to create a good feeling of working together. All of those are critical prerequisites, but it's a different kettle of fish.
Jamie,
Yes, I apologize if I asked something that has been already answered since I wasn't able to be fully present during the first part, especially in response to the last comments. How much are you really emphasizing the process of gestalt switching at the individual psychological level as being an important skill about which to be self-aware, or is that something a part of your paradigm, something that you really stress, and what resources do you use? Heiner, yes?
You see, I designed this cognitive panorama to bring real spaces, context spaces, and semantic repository spaces together. And with the youth doing workshops, they said we have to discuss and relate position, perspective, and frame of references. And they came when I was SSS with Ken Bausch in Atlanta, whatever, 95, presented the House of Horizons and Perspectives. They said House of Eyes, because I, in my workshops, always spoke about the worm's eye, macroscopic, fish eye, bird's eye, group's eye, generation eye, and the I model, U model, they model, and other models, because many esoteric schools just show the colors, shades about the I, but where is the other, and what is we, and who are these others? So we concretely build and model them, otherwise you cannot really negotiate. And so I'm a map and model maker, and I hope this issue of positionality, or like the philosophical anthropology Helmut Plessner said, we humans are not only model making animals, but are able to have an eccentric positionality. We can take on our viewpoint, but other viewpoints, and bring them together in what I call the panorama. It's all in the Encyclopedia of Charles.
If I could answer that same question in complement to Heiner's point of view, SDD seeks to preserve plurality. It does not really seek to change the way people are thinking in general, but to change the way thinking about specific things. And it does not seek to change values, but to reconfigure them. Now, those are powerful points because people can change the way they feel about others, the way they feel about activities, if they can reconfigure an understanding of the way things interact, the nature of their relationships. That's a complex dialogue, and there are ways to do it without using any of the upper end technology that we have, and they've been used in indigenous tribes for a long time. This is the reason that LaDonna Harris joined our board and embraced the design methodology as a form of tribal council practice. She's popularized that throughout the world. But it's not necessary to use technology to talk about whether one idea influences another. It is necessary when the situation is so complex that people forget what they have decided were significant influences. And those influences are felt influences. They're emotional. You could put a number on them, but in the end of the day, it's whether people really feel that something matters a lot. Then they can explore why. So we're very in tune with people's emotions, but we're not trying to dissect people or even liberate them from points of view. We're not really a conflict mediation tool, though there are some practitioners who will insist we are.
So what I find interesting about your answers is that none of you use the word gestalt switch during the answer itself. So I'm still not sure whether we actually are zooming in on the same issue. So I'm not arguing one gestalt as opposed to another. I'm more arguing about or wondering about people's self-awareness, that they may not understand each other because we're attributing the wrong gestalt to another person, or we may ourselves be in a gestalt that does prevent us from grasping what the other is saying. So I'm thinking of it maybe as a literature that is helpful as a tool, but also as a self-improvement tool, so to say. And so I kind of heard you talk about it, but maybe not, because I didn't hear you use the word itself. And as a footnote, I'm coming from Ludwig Fleck, what he wrote, but also what Thomas Kuhn said, that he literally experienced himself a gestalt switch, originally thinking that the paradigm of Aristotle was rubbish, and then suddenly realizing it was actually very sophisticated, and that the same thing may be happening on an agora while we're trying to solve a problem that is really about being able to engage with different gestalts.
Gary, you have a question?
No, I'll make a comment.
A
Thank you.
comment. Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, in listening to the presentations, and I really enjoyed all three of them. I thought they were informative and contributed to the broad status of cybernetics today and how cybernetics today is being addressed in a practical sense. My one comment would be that what I find missing is the general notion of how system scientists as a group or cyberneticians as a group find a way to bind themselves together. What is it about the design of cybernetic thinking that leads to this continual splitting and sub-splitting of ideas about what cybernetics is? It seems to me, the metaphor here that I would contrast it with is the notion of a living organism, where the parts can be very, very small, and they may go through many forms of stresses and strains and interactions and consequences and unforeseen circumstances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the organism as a whole lives. And so these feedback and feed forward mechanisms within an organism, it seemed to me, are worthy of examination by the cyberneticians?
Mo will have a question and then Heiner answer.
Let Heiner respond.
Please.
I like your question, Jerry, very much. You see, Margaret Mead says, who systemizes the systemist, or who integrates the integrators? I came through this work on general system sciences and general model theory together that we need a multimodal approach. We cannot be specialists and generalists at the same time. This is a T intelligence we presented, and Machol, Ropol, and Dürr presented the idea to bring standardization and harmonization together. So an approach to really bridge micro and meso and macro and the disciplines and the time horizons is actually can only be done for addressing the problematic in an and or and beyond mode. What I see with sectarianism of sciences, as we established around the YASA studies, the first transdisciplinary studies in the mid-late 80s, is we have a mindset of fighting about our community, and we over-specialized and over-specialize, making over-claims without overview and orientation. And there I think this approach for the next decades, like Peter has in his graphs, where is complexity and dialogue and system sciences connecting, can only be done by an extra index. So not only symbol and icon. Charles Sander spoke about the index in shared frames of references and going beyond the turf of certain groups. And that is the discussion we have now around IFSR and the encyclopedia. Who is in control and who can edit to a complete body of knowledge, and how is it transparent? Then we go into the discussion of who has data, who can edit it. So anyway, I find
comment on that?
Very interesting, Jerry.
Can I comment on it? I think if you go back to John Warfield's work, you would find that he was very concerned about the grammar of relationships. In the biological world, this transfers into a series of degrees of predication, if you would, where the terminology of the predications determines the form of the logic that is used. And so that the different forms of logic depend on the scope of the predication that you accept in the terms. So this then casts a different shadow across the forms of, shall we say, enlightenment. They come from different scientific terminologies and different scientific notations. And that is a 1-minute summary of my talk for next week.
Oh, that's great. That's a good point. Warfield also proposed very practical means of progressing in spite of those limitations, being a good methodologist. And so one of the clues I like is the idea that the literation, the learning through iteration and sharing the responses of that learning within the development of a discipline. I mean, I think if we took the domain of science model, that approach of having, a practice in cybernetics for translating our applications back into a corpus, not just in talking to each other, but in some way of updating our principles, which is what you can do in a methodology, right? If you have this kind of science or this kind of system science-based methodology like SDD, we're looking at improving a methodology. So that's actually fairly narrow, considering the whole scope of system sciences or the cybernetics as a discipline. But how can we best update aspects of the discipline that we can continue to literate, learn from, and have, I think these discussions are actually quite helpful. I know Tom Heiner and I joined the Club of Remy a little late here, but I think we're part of, we've been having similar discussions in our own communities. And so we're finding, now we need to find ways, I guess, to update what's been learned so we can show that there's been some advancement. Disciplines tend to fragment if there's an entropy to them in a sense. We tend to fall back on the superheroes of the profession, almost as if now that they're gone, we don't have them anymore. I've always thought that's, as much as I respect our lineages, and I think all of us have interesting lineages and mentorships that we've learned from and sources, that there hasn't been enough emphasis on developing kind of new approaches to practice that we don't, that we can still humbly kind of develop, but maybe we aren't the fill the room personalities of some of our mentors of old, as those names that we've mentioned were hard to get in the same room with each other if you look at the kind of the heyday of the field. But we are in a different place now. We're learning from each other. There is more of a sense of the collective wisdom. I think there are different ways of collaborating, and those of us who came to speak today are interested in doing that with stakeholders, but I think also with our community's practice.
One last point maybe. You see, I was with John Warfield and Ralph Weidner in societies where we looked with a broader umbrella, the big scheme, like Pan-Ethic Society, including the reduction of infliction of suffering and happiness, to really bring all these kinds of expressions and annotations and syntax and pragmatics together. And I had with Charles-François this idea to bring this German and Russian and whatever thinkers into the next edition of the encyclopedia, because there is knowledge by having other ways to present. Deixic systems we have in many languages, then that the grammar allows us to give the positionality and the scale into the discussions. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you that John Warfield with his spread thing and link thing and all these things, all this has to come to schools, because we are going on in fragmentation and isolation and sectarianism, but I'm repeating myself.
George, Lucia, Bob, would you like to say something before we close? No?
I just continue learning.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
well,
a great place to be.
I think my takeaway from today is we need to think like beavers. And what do I mean by thinking like beavers? Jamie Hendricks talked about Gestalt shifting, but that's usually a psychological, individualistic aspect. How a beaver thinks is he looks at a stream and says, I'm going to change my environment. And that changing in the environment, and that's where we as cybernetician systems thinkers, we focus on the individualistic because we're coming out of an individualistic phase of self-awareness, freedom, all that good stuff. We are beset by the fragmentation of our context, of our political, how we live together. The ability of our sciences of the systems is to think like beavers and change the environment. But we need to distinguish between vicious cycles and virtuous interactions. What's the design's difference between those two? And that allows us to really have a voice in the public arena now to address two things. One, the limits to thinking, and two, the possibilities of how we design our environment we interact with. The caves we put our images upon influenced people 50,000 years ago. It was a virtuous feedback loop of knowing where to hit that rhino. You know, we need the same sort of thing in terms of our institutional designs. And so the institutional designs of a beaver is how we need to be thinking.
I will add a comment to that, Lowell. The beaver, as he surveys the stream and tries to design how he's going to change his environment, his primary concern deep down in his genes is not virtuous cycles or vicious cycles, but victorious cycles.
Okay, great.
So I would add as a comment that we're not beavers, and that is the point that I'm actually trying to make. I'm coming out of a philosophical tradition that tries to argue that the significant evolutionary event, I mean, not surprisingly, because I'm arguing it myself, is actually the ability to gestalt shift, that they suddenly saw their environment in a different way, and they took advantage of that. But that ability, they also became self-aware of that ability, and whether other people were also able to engage in that. And as I said in the comment section, I'm just thinking of this from an educational perspective, like how early should we make children aware that not everyone thinks like them. There's other different ways of thinking, and that it is valuable to just ask, what do you mean questions, and how that can be used to actually feed in your larger project. So to really kind of think of how our educational system, and especially the use of logic, is being used to facilitate conversations across Gestalt, or actually whether they hinder it because they misrepresent logic, so to say.
We are not beavers, but we can help beavers. Yesterday, I saw a video that a beaver was dragging a tree branch like 10 feet long, very difficultly pulling towards his goal. So there is this guy looks at that and help the beaver. So you see a beaver at the head, leading position, and the guy carrying the rest of the branch, and they go together towards beaver's location. Okay. I should say thank you all to all of you for a wonderful session this morning.
Thank you. Thank you again for hosting us.
Thank you. Bye.
It was a pleasure. Good to meet new people.
Thank you.
Bye.